I'll do some of the introductions and I'll ask you guys to help me. Sitting directly to my right is Andrew Macklin. He's the editor of Renew Canada, is that correct? It's a magazine and he has deep expertise on infrastructure. It's the Infrastructure Magazine. Next is Russell Reed of Sea Change. It's a investment fund, I guess I would call it. I will let you expand on that if you want. Next to him is Rick Doman, who is, what is your exact title?
Well, my background is in the forest industry. I was CEO of Western Forest Products and Ecom Timber Corporation, and I now help Fairfax with their resource opportunities globally, and also I'm chairman of a private investment company, right, and CEO.
So many hats. And we have Scott Northey, who is COO of the Nunavut Resource Corporation. So I'll just do that brief introduction because we want to get started on a discussion here. So this is a panel about public and private investments and how to generate these. So inherently, when you have public money, there is a political angle. And so maybe it makes sense to take a step back and say, just ask, what do each of you, or any of you, feel free to answer if you want, think we can expect from our current government, given what we've seen so far? What are you guys thinking about as we embark on 2020?
Go ahead, Andrew.
All right. Funny enough, so as you can imagine, being a magazine editor in the infrastructure space, this is a conversation that comes up multiple times a day in our office. And I think the most underlying theme for us, other than the fact that, with it still being consistently the Liberal government, we do expect more of the same as far as infrastructure priorities are concerned. Where we think that we will see the biggest shift potentially is with the change of minister. If everyone can remember 3-4 years ago, federal government came out with the Pan-Canadian framework. And one of the biggest notes that was in that, as far as infrastructure is concerned, is this idea of looking at infrastructure funding and investing through a climate lens. That was what we were promised, 3-4 years ago, and I think a lot of us expected that. I don't feel like that truly developed under the ministers that we had in charge of the portfolio during the previous Liberal government. However, when you see that it is now Catherine McKenna who is in charge of that portfolio, someone who has a very strong environmental climate change background, I think that the biggest change that we could see from the previous term of the Liberal government to now is seeing that climate lens become a real thing that we see developed in some form from a federal infrastructure investment point of view. So I think that's the biggest thing we're watching for.
And that's a really interesting point. But can you just expand a little on what you think that could mean or what it might look like? What does it mean to...
Oh, my favorite, speculating without facts, something that I never like to be labeled as the fake news guy. Since I'm being asked to speculate, I guess I will speculate in this case. A lot of you in the room were here for the earlier conversation I had a chance to moderate, where we were talking about some of those, how do we look at long-term viability of an infrastructure project that has a 50, 75, 100-year expectation of being a viable asset, knowing that 10 years from now, the climate could be completely different. We could be having more severe resilience issues. We could be having different temperatures. And I think having to have that analysis and having to build infrastructure with that in mind, I think is probably what we can expect from the climate lens, because it's not acceptable, I wouldn't think, from a federal government perspective to say, we are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into your project with an expected 75-year lifespan, but you are building it based on the environment that you are dealing with right this moment, not forward thinking at all, seeing what the environmental realities could be 10 and 20 years from now, and how to add that extra layer of resilience into that infrastructure asset at time of construction.
Okay.
One thing to add sort of what I think the federal government's going to do, and having been on the front line of seeking money from within the federal government, I certainly know that the project that I've been working on, Grays Bay Road and Port, that Stanley talked about earlier, that's the same with the Slave Geological Province Road and the Kavalik Energy Corridor. At the heart of it, the federal government does not right now have an implementable program to fund nation-building projects. And you can use the term nation-building loosely, but at the heart of it, it's nation-building means things that do make sense in the long term. They just don't make commercial sense in the short term. So we've got to find a way through that. People point to the infrastructure bank as being an entity that should be performing that role. It's not yet, and I do agree, based on our dealings with the federal government, that the federal government believes that is the actual entity that should be getting involved in this. They've just, they've staffed it with people like me who are bankers looking for returns. And for nation-building projects, your return horizon is like 50 to 75 years. And so as a consequence, I see the federal government either developing a new program, maybe carving some money out of the infrastructure bank, take some of the capital away from the infrastructure bank, put it into a new program that focuses on nation-building projects and use people who actually know how to adjudicate projects for which there's not going to be a commercial return, maybe a good return in terms of tax revenues generated or royalty revenues generated in our case. And I think that's an area where I think we're going to see a renewed focus, that there's a recognition there's a big vacuum of funding programs right now at the federal government for this stuff.
Okay, well that sounds optimistic in a sense. To follow up on something you said, this is a discussion we had, I think, before at some point. I think you may have archly pointed out the infrastructure bank is inherently, whatever they do, it's going to be analyzed and seen through a political lens. How do people feel about how the infrastructure bank, the pace at which the infrastructure bank is moving so far? Do you think it could be moving faster? I mean, given that there is this sort of political angle beyond the sort of financial analysis.
Well, short answer is I don't think they should have been moving faster, because they didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing, and they had to staff up, hire people, put in place the governance, and understand the decision-making process, both within the organization and with the federal government. So I think it was going to be a slow process from the get-go. The big issue is I think they've not been given the right directions, and I think that's probably going to come from the federal government, that, look, you have to focus on this stuff. This is the stuff that everyone's, the high-profile things that, can take a new subway line over the line and be built in Toronto, London, Hamilton, Montreal, whatever. There's the other pocket which says, well, we're not looking for a return on this, but as long as we get our capital back, we're good. And then there's a third pocket, which is what's been sadly lacking, is there's no discussion whatsoever in projects that they don't actually expect to see much capital back commercially. They can get it back in terms of tax revenues and royalties, but that's not what they're looking at, is in terms of providing returns to the federal government. So,
well, I would just add, I think projects like Grays Bay Road and Port and Churchill and so on, there's a lot of talk from the United States about the NATO 2% budget in terms of military and so on. These ports are important also from a military perspective as well as commercial, and that's another way I think Canada should look at these, because these are, as Scott said, nation-building opportunities, but there's dual purposes, and I think that's a path we should be considering.
agreed.
That could be a possibility then, hopefully, maybe, I think. So there was some reports, I think, about the infrastructure bank potentially funding a transmission line, if I recall correctly.
I think, I'm not going to steal anyone's thunder here, they're working with them to try to develop the feasibility study that would allow, sorry, Sonia, GNWT, they're working with you guys on, which one, Mackenzie or? In Tulsa, okay. Yeah, that's probably the best one for them to be looking at, because that's probably got the most reasonable chance of being commercially viable of all the three. But
yeah, and so I guess maybe just sort of continuing to look forward and putting on my journalist hat. How do you guys? I mean, these should, I guess, when we look forward, these should open up new opportunities. And how do you guys see, sort of like, how do you see, what does the future look like, I guess, then, if we know a little bit about some of what may be funded? Like, what sorts of, developments can we expect, I guess, going forward, if we have some of these, if we have more roads, more transmission lines, that kind of thing?
Like I can say in the short term, our objective is to try to generate mineral exploration activities because we know it's a very geologically rich region. It's like a region that straddles Ontario, Quebec, which includes Val-d'Or and Timmins. It's called the Abitibi Geological Province. And so we think there's tremendous opportunities to develop that activity, leading ideally to some mine developments. And the important thing in this case is that the mine developments will be only with the consent of the folks who own the road and the port, which is in our case Inuit, and in the NWT, some of the First Nations will likely get involved in that too. So you earn your license, and you earn for the indigenous population. You have the control over the process, and you have control over your destiny. You can say don't like that, do like that, and gives them at least the opportunity to participate, generate wealth, which we've talked about as being one of the great challenges, now while still preserving their culture and not sacrificing the environment.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was just gonna say, just to talk to that a little bit. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is that because we're seeing different partnership models, different procurement models. You talk about access to resource, and I think about the Yukon Resource Gateway project, $454 million, I think. And I think what's great about projects like that is that this provides the real tangible example of how we do the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one and the next one, is that because we're seeing some of these unique partnerships to build infrastructure mega projects across country, I don't think we were at a point where we could just do 8 of these things and say we know how to do this. I think we need, in so many cases, we need that one that allows us to say, okay, so in order to build a major roadway project that takes into consideration access to mining resources, and that also allows us to get new contact points with some of our communities, let's get that one done. Let's get it done right. Let's learn from any mistakes. And then let's do the other 8, 10, 12, because we know how to do this now. I think we can all agree that this is a very risk-averse country that we live in. So to be able to have that one model of getting it done right, that when we can duplicate, is so incredibly valuable, especially in the infrastructure space.
So what I hear you saying is there's a learning curve almost in that.
I think so. I mean, certainly we've learned about it in Toronto with transit.
That's true.
But I mean, but the important thing is that are we willing to learn from our mistakes, build that model so we can do it right every other time? Because we've got so much to build. We've got so much to invest in. It makes it so much more viable if we have a model of success for doing it right in different regions, for building all season roads that last, for building transportation networks to resources. I think it's just, it allows us to have that base to work from.
That's certainly a great launching off point, I think, for a bigger sort of question I want to put to you guys, which is, do we have, what do you guys, and I'll throw it out there for anyone who wants to ask it, but do we have a strategy? Do you think that the Canadian government has a strategy for developing it? And I think most people are probably going to say no, but maybe explain why and what sort of strategy could look like if we did have one.
Who wants to fall on their sword first? I would say no. Yeah, I would say there's no strategy. I think they've done a lot of work trying to gather the information necessary to build a strategy without actually generating a strategy. And my hope would be that they'd be able to identify key nodes of infrastructure need, whether it's transportation, housing, even education, and obviously telecommunications. Identify these key nodes of need and then start to work towards scraping away at those identified nodes of need. And that hasn't happened. There's no prioritization of what the nodes of need should be and how to scrape away at them. It's just really dumping the stuff on the table and say, look at all that stuff we have. Wow, it's a lot, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. On to the next. So that's the way I look at it.
Is I mean, Russell, you're a very analytic guy. Maybe you would know this, or I'm sure maybe someone else would. But like, is there a template that says like, look, this is what we need to prioritize if we just build, we have like all these geological resources defined, these are the major costs, we could get the most bang for our buck. I mean, what sorts of things would entail, would we need to do to create a grand vision? What would it require? What would go into sort of shifting, creating some sort of vision for the Arctic so that we could begin to move the discussion a little forward, I guess, and start to, so that it's no longer just, these are huge costs, but this has lowered the cost X amount for X number of projects or something.
So there are some examples of successful resource development that's been driven in large measure by the government, but it's the government as catalyst, as facilitator. And interestingly enough, one of those success stories is from an economy that doesn't have a lot of indigenous natural resources, which is in Singapore. So Singapore is sort of an economic wonder because it's sort of, depending how you're measuring it, is the highest per capita income country on the planet with no natural resources. And they had, which is pretty interesting in and of itself, so Temasek is the development investor for Singapore, and different than its sovereign wealth entity, they have a development investor. Similarly, in the Middle East, in the country of UAE, there's an entity called Mubadala, and Mubadala, not the sovereign entity of ADIA, but Mubadala. And what those institutions did, which was actually fairly important, was to view themselves as a catalyst for institutional investment. So they will not do a project, generally a development project, just on their own. But they have a purpose for creating the conditions for the projects to get underway. What I found when working with them is that there was a very healthy dynamic. Namely, if a project just didn't make sense, then it wouldn't happen. So because they weren't putting all the funding for a project. But if there were certain things like a first loss position, that would, in order to change the risk character of an investment, they would do that. They would do what was necessary to make the private sector want to take ownership of something. So when I look at the Canadian case, I think there are these examples of particularly de-risking of projects that could happen. And the Arctic region can be more expensive. It's an inhospitable place. It's a general problem we have throughout the Arctic region, that without the governments generally taking a more active role, we kind of know what the results will be. It will not simply evolve to the Arctic having great development projects. So the governments need to play a transformative role. But I think there are these examples where it's been done successfully.
I think the other point, just to your earlier question, I think the problem with priorities is that, of course, priorities are in the eye of the beholder. In this case, the political party that's occupying Parliament Hill at any given time. So I think that, yes, the whole reason I'm even here today is because of a conversation Jessica and I had with the infrastructure minister over the lack of a national northern infrastructure agenda. And you're right, we absolutely have to have some sort of game plan as a country because we're so far behind on infrastructure development nationwide. But we have to appreciate the fact that what that looks like today could change on election day, just like that, and get completely upended whether we like it or not. So I think that once we get ourselves to a point that we build an agenda, it's up to all of us to continue to strengthen the resolve of why that should be, sorry for lack of a better term, left the hell alone when the next guy comes into Parliament.
Absolutely makes sense. And so what I heard you guys, and during this discussion, it seems like the strategy has to be sort of apolitical enough that it can sort of survive a change in elections. It has to, I mean, it's possible that it could draw on sort of military funding, and Canada's role in the military also, of course, has to, I think, sort of deal with the environment and benefits to the people living there. And it also, what Russell was saying, it sounds like there has to be some appetite for losses at first, or not losses, but projects that the government is funding for nation building, to use Scott's term. So one, I think, successful project maybe we can talk about if we have time is the Churchill Port and Rail project, which is now completed, and as I understand it, there's service to new communities. As people who are studying the Arctic, what sorts of, are you already sort of, has that had a sort of impact that I think we've been describing and other people have described, where it sort of sets a model of success that can be replicated, or have we seen sort of impacts already from it? Is anyone able to tackle this one, or is
You're on the board, man.
If you can't answer it, Rick, that's okay.
Well, I think I can talk generally, and maybe going to Russell's point too about Singapore, and Lee Kuan was a visionary leader who built that country into what it is today. And I think Canada, with 7.7 billion people in the world today, Canada is well positioned with 37 million people, the second largest country in the world by landmass, to provide different commodities and different products to the world. And I think we don't have that vision. And in regards to Churchill, I think the federal government deserves some credit for helping us at Fairfax rebuild the railway and get it functioning again. There's 27 Indigenous communities along the route. That's very important to them, and of course to the community of Churchill. And there's great opportunities to export grain and other commodities out of that port, as well as potential military uses too, just like Grays Bay Road and Port. But I think Canada doesn't think big enough in this world, and we get caught up in localized issues, and we're not getting our products to the market. And but we have a lot to offer, including in the territories, and I think there's tremendous potential for our country, and we shouldn't let, the environment is very important, but we have to be careful how we handle this. My background's a forest industry, and I've been working on projects, for example, in the Yukon since 2008 to try to look at forestry opportunities in cogen, and they've been infested with the spruce bark beetle and the mountain pine beetle, so the trees won't be there, and that's not related to climate change. The root problem is we didn't address those issues early on, because Sweden, Finland, Norway have the same issues, but they manage their forests very well. There is an opportunity in the Northwest Territories for forest opportunities. So while we're waiting, we actually are losing an asset, that being the forest. That's an 80-year cycle, so that's a contribution negatively to the environment. Those forests are no longer absorbing carbon, they're emitting carbon. So my view is we have to think bigger. Churchill is something that we've certainly thought a lot about, and hope that it can contribute in a positive way to Canada, and we need more of that.
Absolutely. I think we could probably all agree that Canadians need to be better big picture thinkers too. Yeah.
In some sense, what it feels like, based on international experience, is that there's sort of lacking an institution, a development institution in Canada that can abstract from and that can survive changes in political authority. That if it's simply a matter of legislation, you're sort of in trouble. The legislation can be tenuous, changes with each administration, with each election, and hence, the staying power associated with infrastructure, which is a by its nature, is something which requires a lot of capital and requires, even for investors, they need to have confidence that the landscape is not going to change on them. And so the lesson of Temasek or Mubadala is having a development investment institution that's created by a government, but will survive elections, and that seems to be, at least from my standpoint, without that, there's an extra level of political risk, which is going to lead to an underinvestment in infrastructure inherently.
Yeah. This is a way of de-risking. Well, this is a lot of rich conversation. It seems like we could write I'm sure plenty of people here could write an op-ed about how we could form a government organization to set this agenda, and I would love to read that.
I don't think the bank is that far away from it personally. The first tier of their mandate is to actually provide things like first loss protection, loan guarantees, performance guarantees, revenue guarantees, that kind of stuff. And the second tier is a little more nebulous, and the third tier doesn't seem to exist. And it's really the third tier for the North is kind of required, where you kind of need someone to step up and say, we're not looking to get a return on this commercially for the next 50 years, but we want this to contribute positively to the fabric of Canada, and if it generates additional tax revenue through economic development and royalty revenues through mine development, fantastic, that's great. So that's I think we're not far. We just and your point is very well taken, because I'm not sure that entity would actually survive a change in government right now, and maybe it gets a little bit more entrenched, and maybe it will be able to. But your point's very well taken.
The question I want to build off that, though, is that, if the bank has been set up with a very specific mandate based on, getting revenue back as part of the investments that they're doing. So when I hear the other projects you're talking about that have more of that long-term return on investment, see, that says to me, great, so let's take some of the ones that the federal government wants to invest in now, let's put them over to the bank because they fit that model. And the kind of ones you're talking about that are long-term and aren't going to make money for 40, 50 years, that's the stuff that the federal government should be putting their own money towards right now. It's realizing that we have a couple of different models for getting infrastructure done and making sure that these ones go over here because that's where they make the most sense, and these ones go over here, and these ones go over here, and making sure that we are actually investing at them through the right forum because of factors like, hey, this doesn't have an immediate payoff, but boy, oh boy, it has a long-term one. Federal government would be nuts not to then say, right, yeah, you're right. That's going to significantly increase our tax revenue 30 years down the road from now. That's a great investment long-term. That's what we should be focusing our infrastructure dollars towards. Yeah.
Agreed.
Excellent.
Sorry. The reason I was a bit jumpy in my chair, because we actually do have a strategy like that. And I feel as if it hasn't even, everybody's not aware of it. The national shipbuilding strategy, right, was put in place because we lost the ability to build ships. Okay, so what we did, and we created a directorate of national shipbuilding strategy that has survived the government today. And we invested in pre-selected yards. East Coast, West Coast, both C-SPAN and Irving. I'm talking about $300–400 million to rebuild those yards because we didn't have an industry anymore and a downstream industry. From that, we said, every contract and profit you make off of us, there's gonna be a 0.5% that has to be reinvested in the maritime sector, all right? That's called the NSSVP, National Shipbuilding Strategy Value Proposition. ISED manages it, so it has nothing to do with politics. You get a value proposition. I have a project, I am Irving, I wanna spend $5 million for this tech startup, for this blah, blah, blah. So what I would like to throw to the panel here is, do you see a value such a strategy that is anchored in policy, but says, hey, federal government, same thing, we will build these roads, but mining corporations, blah, whatever, we don't want the money back. We wanted you to reinvest that maybe 0.5% back into the resource industry of, well, in our case, it was the maritime industry, but in the case, it has to be northern. Like, the policy is set there, and then once it passes legislation, it's very difficult to remove it. So I guess I throw that at, economically or even sort of feasibility, would that apply here? Because we're doing it right now. It took us 10 years to get there, and we're cutting steel today, all right? And so a lot of mom and pop shops are getting bearings made, and there's a downstream effect that we said as a nation, it took us, between the interwar period, I know I'm talking a little bit, between the interwar period, all right, the only reason why we were able to build corvettes is because we had a minute capability to build ships in Canada. And we said never again we're going to be in that position where something happens and we were just caught with our pants down. So I throw that to the panel here and going, is there something similar that could be mirrored from the NSS National Shipbuilding Strategy?
Does anyone feel qualified to?
Qualified, no, but I have a view. No, I think you always should be looking at precedents and different models for coming at things, and clearly this is all new territory for most people, especially as it relates to the north, so it sounds like a great model to be looking at. So my own view is that we should find a way to discuss this, because we're in Ottawa quite a lot talking to the federal government, trying to help them to find a way to put money aside to fund some of these projects that they don't have money set aside for right now. So I'm all ears.
I think this dual purpose concept is a particularly important one. If it's single purpose, you may not have critical mass to get through, but the concept that something could have military importance and then it creates a commercial complement, that's something that is that's probably part of the template for making this work. That if it's just about a single purpose, you don't get things done. So the more you can have these complementarities, the more I think the Arctic infrastructure becomes appealing. So I think that it's a great case. It's a great case where and I think Canada does a better job than the United States. For other reasons. So it's so Canada. Just kind of to your point, a lot of the rudiments are sort of there for getting this right. I still think obviously there's underinvestment in the infrastructure for the Arctic, but it doesn't take much, I think, at this point to actually change that equation.
Right here. Yeah. I wanted to pick up where. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, go ahead. You go next.
Okay, good, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on a few of the points that Parliamentary Secretary Jones raised this morning about the Northern and Arctic Policy Framework, and pick up on some of your points, Scott. So I'm with Polar Knowledge Canada, which reports to the Minister of Northern Affairs, but we're not part of the department of INAC, or CERNA, I guess it's called Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. So there's a distinction there, but it's the same minister. So our organization, Polar, is not leading the Northern and Arctic Policy Framework, but we're participating in it. And the stage it's at now, and it's very different than the way things have been done in the past, federal folks in Ottawa listened to folks across the north. What are your priorities? What are your challenges, et cetera, et cetera? And that's the underpinning, and Scott, you referenced it, the chapters and so on. We've heard a lot, and we're now at the point of saying, okay, let's make some sense out of this. We've heard what we've heard. And I think that's politically durable, because even if it's a different government, Northerners would probably say the same thing. And it's an opportunity to inform a Government of Canada initiative, and it's based on partnership and being driven by Northern needs, Indigenous input, territorial government input. So it's fairly solid, very durable in that sense. The needs aren't about to change. The next step is kind of coming up with what's being termed the investment strategy. What do we need to do to move ahead on some of these things? And the other piece that's in play is the complex governance issue. We want this to be co-developed and co-delivered with Northerners and Indigenous Northerners in particular. And that's a very, very different way of doing made in Ottawa things. So it's a bit of an experiment for the federal government, but I think the risks of doing something experimental are worthwhile because it will lead to a very different outcome, one that's much more informed by Northern voices, Northern perspectives, including Indigenous perspectives. But it's an experiment. We don't have a lot of experience doing it that way. So I think, some continued goodwill and some continued open minds, it is the opportunity, it hasn't been done yet, but it's the opportunity to achieve, Scott, what you were looking for. What is the plan going forward? How do we prioritize some of these things? How do we stream some of these projects into the infrastructure bank versus other things versus, well, the nation building bit? If nothing will happen unless we do this, if we do this, many things might happen, but they're not going to pay the project back in 5 years. So there's a spectrum of things that need to happen. So stay tuned. The current effort is on building the governance framework to manage that policy, which is, a lot of decision makers not based in Ottawa, and at the same time figuring out how we want to mobilize that collectively in a co-developed kind of way. So very challenging moving forward. I think everyone agrees there's no other way to do it. The way we've always done it doesn't work. We're doing it in a different way, but we haven't got it done yet. There is no answer yet, but that's the direction we need to go in. And I think, a lot of it is additional dialogues. And frankly, when venues such as this come up with great ideas and start to mobilize them, very strong potential to influence how that will come together.
Yeah.
Because the government's looking for additional ideas.
So point
Just want to
taken.
put that comment on the table.
That's good, great. Yeah. Okay, one last.
Real fast, so I'm on the next panel, so I'm cutting up my own time with John's. But I'm Drew Fagan. I'm a Prophet U of T, but I was Deputy Minister of Infrastructure in Ontario. And I just want to address the good question with regard to national capital plans. And I think the reason we haven't had a national capital plan, whereas Australia, New Zealand, and others have, is that most of the spending traditionally in a country that in fiscal terms is very decentralized has been done at the provincial and municipal level. And the feds have actually doubled their spending over the last 7 or 8 years, but they haven't actually thought that through in terms of doing their own plan, in part because of the challenges of federalism about it. It's the nature of the amount of spend which has changed, and I think they have to think about this, but also the nature of the country. The point about politics, Andrew, that you made, I think is a good one as well. The political process here is heavier in infrastructure than you see in other countries. And I actually think, and John and I have talked about this, the bank has a role to play with regard to taking some of the talons out of that by increasing the capacity of government and the private sector to work together in terms of analysis, in terms of data, and in terms of other aspects, and in actually transparency about decision making to ensure that when politicians make decisions that are on a political basis rather than an analytical basis, they at least get more significant pushback on it. And the best example of that actually is transit in Toronto, where there have been all sorts of decisions made on a political basis that were not ideal decisions, regardless of political stripe or party.